forces accelerate their withdrawal from Vietnam. The difficulties demonstrated by the ARVN's first major operation without U.S. ground support hasn't lessened Nixon's determination to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. In March of 1972, with U.S. troop strength the lowest it has been in 7 years, the NVA suddenly stunned the world by launching a massive three-pronged attack into the South. Nearly 150,000 enemy troops, along with supporting armor and artillery units, launched conventional frontal assaults against thinly held ARVN defensive lines. As some South Vietnamese units begin to crumble, President Nixon once again goes on national television, this time to try to help a faltering ally by building a case for a new phase of the war.
Throughout the war in Vietnam, the United States has exercised a degree of restraint unprecedented in the annals of war. However, when the enemy abandons all restraint, throws its whole army into battle on the territory of its neighbor, refuses to negotiate, we simply face a new situation. In these circumstances, any president who failed to act decisively would have betrayed the trust of his country and betrayed the cause of world peace.
After a 3-year suspension, the U.S. begins large-scale bombings inside North Vietnam. For the first time, the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi is targeted. Over the next 5.5 months, 200,000 tons of bombs rain down on the North, while U.S. forces complete their final withdrawal from the South. President Nixon, who is running for re-election, is under pressure to bring the troops home. And so despite the ongoing bombing, on August 11th, 1972, the last U.S. ground combat unit departs South Vietnam. America's ground operations officially end, but the war in Vietnam does not. Without a signed peace treaty, the future of South Vietnam, as well as more than 500 American prisoners of war who are awaiting release in the North, remains uncertain. Finally, in October, Henry Kissinger announces a breakthrough in his negotiation with North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho.
Peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight.
But days after Kissinger's optimistic announcement, South Vietnam's President Thieu rejects the treaty when he learns it allows North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South. Resolution of the POW issue goes on hold. For Ann Purcell, whose husband Ben was captured almost 5 years before, it is almost unbearable.
It was a roller coaster. We felt hopeful, and then our hope would be dashed, and then again a hope, and then dashed again. It was just a roller coaster one week after the other. And I remember saying to the Lord in prayer, when I don't know how much longer I can hold on.
Negotiations continue for the next 3 months, until on January 27, 1973, after continued bombing of the North and much U.S. pressure on the South, all parties finally signed the Paris Peace Accords. Hostilities are to cease immediately, but North Vietnamese troops are allowed to stay inside the South, on the condition that they do not continue to build up their forces or resume aggressions.
I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
"28 years earlier, at the end of World War II, Times Square in New York City erupted in spontaneous celebration. Not so in 1973.
This is Ken Alvord in Times Square in New York City, where the major visible observance is the end of the war is the great sign Peace down the side of the Allied Chemical Building. The sign flashed on and the moving news wire below it signaled the word over and over for a minute. And on this rainy, cold evening here, there were a few around to see it. Times Square, which had filled again and again over the years with crowds demanding peace, and a rather smaller crowd to celebrate its arrival. There were other observances as the hour came.
8 years after the Marines first landed in Vietnam, the war that divided a nation is finally over. And the unwinding of America's involvement can begin. Three weeks after the Paris Peace Agreement is signed, the return of America's prisoners of war begins. For hundreds of families across America, it's the end of an emotional journey.
After 5.5 years, I know what makes America great. It's you, the people. Thank you so much for your support. I love you this much. I love you this much.
My stomach is in knots. For 5 years, I've done nothing but dream about this moment. Dear Mrs. Benjamin Purcell,
on behalf of the Secretary of the Army, I wish to inform you. I can't do it. Give me a minute. And that's strange, that I'd cry when I knew he was coming up. We all were transported by bus or sedan to the airport, and we were all waiting in our little groups. And we were all waiting and waiting and waiting till the plane came, and they had the red carpet. They had all these bank of microphones for them to each one speak as they got off. Ben was the highest ranking.
Is the highest ranking on the plane, and they let him off first.
Distinguished arrival, Colonel Benjamin H. Purcell.
As soon as Ben steps out the door, the children start screaming. They're so excited they can barely control themselves. Even I can hardly keep myself together.
Fellow Georgians, some 5.5 years ago,
I'm trying so hard to control myself and wait for him to finish speaking. But all I want to do is just touch him, so that I can be sure that this is for real, and that he's real.
The Gulf of Mexico. Instead,
I can't take it anymore. So in the middle of this speech, I run out of the crowd and straight up to him.
at this moment, my years of loneliness and my wife's long vigil comes to a happy end.
could run out there and hug you, I knew that you were finally home. And then I think that's the moment that it took for me to really believe that you were going to come back.
What a wonderful thing. You're my angel.
For many Americans, the return of the POWs marks the final conclusion of the Vietnam War. The troubles of Southeast Asia slipped from the daily newscasts, giving way to reports of the Watergate break-in and subsequent political firestorm.
There was talk this weekend that the president should resign and under siege because of the Watergate scandal.
As president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
By the time Gerald Ford assumes the presidency in August of 1974, U.S. aid to South Vietnam has been cut by 75% since its height a year earlier. For the ARVN, who've depended upon American money and military supplies since 1954, the cutbacks have a devastating effect. Planes sit idle on runways, unable to take off because of lack of fuel. Artillery pieces that had once been allocated 100 rounds per day are rationed to only 10. But while the ARVN's supplies are dwindling, the North Vietnamese are rebuilding their military strength. On March 10th, 1975, just over 2 years after the Paris Peace Agreement was signed, hopes for an independent South Vietnam come crumbling down. The North Vietnamese launched their largest and most ambitious offensive yet into the South. As ARVN units begin to falter, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians run for their lives. On April 21st, President Thieu resigns. 4 days later, NVA forces reach the outskirts of Saigon.